Hello, I'm Congressman Anthony Brown, and it's an honor to join the members of the Reserve Organization of America for this year's National Convention. I'm only sorry that I couldn't join you in person for what I know is an informative and engaging conference. ROA has a proud history of advocating for our national defense, with reserve components adding strength as an essential partner in the total force. So let me thank you, President, Colonel Judy Davenport, USA retired, for your leadership, as well as the members of the Executive Committee, the National Staff, and the National Council for your service to your members and to our nation. Having served in the Army Reserves for 25 years, I know firsthand the critical role that you contribute to the national security mission, and that the United States is stronger and more secure from your continued service to our nation. The global security environment today is more challenging than we've seen in decades. While we ended the war in Afghanistan, in which many of you served, we cannot allow violent extremist organizations in that region to present a threat to the United States or our allies. Malign actors such as Iran and North Korea continue to engage in destabilizing actions in the Middle East and the Pacific, and they threaten our homeland through asymmetric capabilities. Most challenging is the return to global power competition with Russia, and more troubling, with China, both of which are determined to revise the international order established after World War II. Strategic competition with China plays out across the globe, but not every competitor is seen as an adversary. It's China's pursuit of regional hegemony in the Indo-Pacific in the near term, and the global displacement of the U.S. in the long term, which has caused us to label China as our nation's chief adversary and pacing threat. In response to China's expansionism, Congress established, and I fully supported, the Indo-Pacific Deterrence Initiative. This initiative has, among its goals, increasing our military presence and joint force lethality, strengthen our ally and partner relationships and capability, and expanding and enhancing our training and experimentation in the Pacific. This past August, I led a congressional delegation to Indo-PACOM. We had productive engagements with the Indo-PACOM Commander, Admiral Aquilino, the USAPAC Commander, General Flynn, and Admiral Paparo, the PAC Fleet Commander, to better understand the challenges and opportunities in the region. And there are many. China has surpassed our other potential adversaries, and it's clearly now the pacing threat for the Defense Department's planning for deterrence and military operations. While I'm confident in our ability to fight and win any conflict with China today, albeit a conflict that would inflict massive casualties on both China and the United States, I'm concerned about our strategic positioning in the Indo-Pacific in the coming decades. President Xi Jinping has announced China's intentions to modernize their national defense and armed forces by 2035, with the goal of fielding a world-class military by 2049. It should be seen as no coincidence that this date coincides with the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, or that it aligns with Xi's long-stated blueprint to make China a global superpower by 2050. In these national objectives, China doesn't see themselves merely as rising to challenge the current world order. They see their goal as a rejuvenation of their nation, a revision of the international order, and a restoration to a time when they were a global leader. China has a long-term view of competition, in part because of its history, and is willing to create and follow strategies and plans which span nearly half a century to achieve their objectives. Western military strategists have applied various theories over time to try to understand the grand strategy of China, from Sun Tzu's Art of War to Deng's Hide and Bide. Nearly 20 years ago, the Strategic Studies Institute at the Army War College theorized that China's approach to strategic competition could be viewed through the strategy board game of Go. In Go, winning occurs not through attrition, as in checkers or chess, but through addition, adding pieces to the board to surround and outmaneuver your opponent, building slowly to a winning position. While we shouldn't oversimplify the PRC's strategy, nor ignore their constant adaptations, China's territorial expansions have proven this theory to be insightful. They've added positions to the board in the South China Sea through reclaiming and militarizing disputed atolls and other sea features. China has used fishing boats as a militia in gray zone conflict, extending the size of their naval presence to dispute territory and disrupt commerce. They've reorganized and expanded the PLA rocket force as its own service within the armed forces, bolstering the role of long-range missiles in their posture. This includes developing and fielding the so-called carrier killers in the DF-21 and DF-26, which aim to deny access to our aircraft carriers. They are introducing new, more accurate nuclear missiles and making advances on delivery systems, as most recently reported that China launched a rocket-carrying hypersonic glide vehicle which flew through low-orbit space, circumnavigating Earth and narrowly missing its target by roughly 24 miles. China has also reset the norms of operations in the region, testing repeatedly and consistently the boundaries of Taiwan's air defense zone, encroaching on Japan's and South Korea's exclusive economic zones in the East China Sea, increased fighting recently against Indian troops along their shared border, and increasing its military footprint in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan as a direct challenge to India's influence in South Asia. And engaging in debt trap diplomacy, shrouded in its Belt and Road Initiative that preys on resource-rich, financially unstable nations like Laos most recently, which enables China to gain a hold over strategic assets and resources. Our country hasn't faced an adversary whose actions have demanded an overhaul of our strategy and doctrine since the end of the Cold War. In the late 1970s, the United States and our European allies were confronted with a Soviet force which, had war broken out, threatened to defeat our ground forces through overwhelming numbers. The strength of Soviet reserves held in depth created a scenario in which, even if our army won the first fight, success in the second and third engagements would have been unlikely. The response to strategic competition then was the doctrine of air-land battle. This new doctrine led to close coordination between the Army and Air Force, which fundamentally, if not formally, altered our military budgeting and planning processes. The new doctrine of air-land battle and the associated force structure and operational changes that followed gave us a confidence that we would prevail in an actual conflict with the Soviet Union or any opposing land force for that matter. The application of air-land battle in the Persian Gulf War both validated its concepts for our military and led China to reassess their own approach to warfare. In our development of a strategy and doctrine to deter China and counter their aggression, we have yet to arrive at the next evolution in our military operations. We've focused on counting the number of ships, bombers, and fighter jets in the inventory of our force structure, all to ensure we have a quantitative and qualitative advantage. We've looked to modernize our force structure in the same way that we always have, fielding the next iteration of our strongest platforms, whether that be an F-35, a next-generation air dominance fighter, or a Columbia-class submarine. These are modernization activities that are necessary. To be certain, we need the capabilities to counter the advanced technology that is being fielded by China, whether that's the J-20 stealth fighter jet or the Type 055 destroyers. Yet these programs are insufficient against an adversary with a unified national cause to achieve their former status once more atop the global order. To answer the challenge posed by China in the Indo-Pacific, we must evolve our military doctrine. We need to ensure that we're fully employing every component of the joint force. While it's understandable that much focus has been on our Air Force and Navy in this expansive theater of operation that is defined more by water and air than it is by land, we cannot lose sight of the significant role and contributions to be made by the Army. Geographic limitations of distance and domain apply equally to all combatants. Whether the forces are Chinese, U.S., Korean, Japanese, Australian, or Taiwanese, they all need to account for these operational challenges. China has adapted to these constraints by dividing their land forces into the traditional service and a rocket service. In many ways, the challenges our military faces in the Indo-Pacific are a direct result of China's land forces, which provide command and control over short-range ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles, which hold at risk American and Allied runways and hangars within the First Island chain, and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which extend the anti-access envelope to our bomber bases and aircraft carriers. In contrast, we have thus far minimized the role of our own land forces, choosing to focus on naval and air elements. The United States Army must meet them in kind. We should ensure our land forces are a major player in Indo-Pacific strategic competition, complicating the assumptions, planning, and operations of our adversaries. Land operations have strategic value that cannot be replicated in other domains, including long-term persistence, the ability to mass combat power, and fostering strong relationships with our partners and allies. The joint operations in airline battle, with the Air Force enabling the operations of the Army, should be reinvigorated, refined, and incorporated into the evolving joint warfighting concepts of today and tomorrow. The Army must hold China's missile launchers, bombers, and fighters at risk in the same manner that they threaten our forces. And if conflict does occur, land-based capability would generate needed combat power until we can degrade China's anti-access capability. The need to hold and defend territory, including the bases from which our fighter jets operate, and our ships refuel, is embodied in the core Army role of missile defense, and is paramount in the Indo-Pacific. We need to look at new concepts of operations, including the use of land-based launchers in multi-domain operations against threats in the sea and air. There are some who believe that the U.S. force posture is well aligned with our commitments, interests, and threats in the region. And there are others who believe that the U.S. is out of position, particularly when it comes to the Army. Perhaps I'm biased because of my 30 years in the Army, but I accept General Flynn's assessment, which he laid out while in his previous capacity as the Army's G357. Allotting the Army a major and increased presence in the Indo-Pacific holds the key to addressing the nation's 21st century security challenges. The Army's vision for transformed land power in the Indo-Pacific and the strategic lever to regain a competitive stance against China is increased presence of forces. General Flynn believes, and I concur, that positioning U.S. ground forces throughout the region, in Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, India, and Indonesia as prospective locations, but also eventually in Malaysia and Vietnam, will persuade China to behave. While this won't happen overnight, the U.S. must leverage all of our diplomatic and economic positions of strength to create the conditions and relationships for a greater Army presence in the Indo-Pacific. Each of the services has begun exploring how to conduct operations across the domains of land, sea, air, cyber, and space. Whether it's the Army's multi-domain operations, the joint all-domain operations of the Air Force, or the Navy's distributed maritime operations, or the Marines' expeditionary advanced space operations. We are seeing and learning from experimentation, such as in the Army's Project Convergence and the Navy's triennial large-scale exercises. It's becoming more and more apparent that we need an overarching, comprehensive strategy for how to conduct joint, multi-domain operations. And that each of the services, the Navy, Marines, Air Force, Space Force, and the Army, are bringing every capability and tactic to better position us for strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. And with the growing European interest and enhanced presence in the Indo-Pacific, better coordination is also needed if Europeans are to contribute to the region's security and defense and be serious partners by the countries there. As we continue to examine our posture and as we await the results of the DoD's Global Force Posture Review, we must ensure that we're maximizing one of our nation's greatest military assets, the reserve component. In strategic competition with our adversaries, you are the players that Russia and China cannot place on the board. Today, so much of our national technology and innovation capacity is driven by and held within the private sector. The United States has the most vibrant, innovative, and advanced economies in history. Through the reserves and National Guard, you can work at leading technology companies on cutting-edge innovation and then bring your knowledge and expertise gained in the civilian sector to the armed forces. We need you to push boundaries of space exploration with a day job at SpaceX or Blue Origin, and then use those same skills in the service of your country to track the orbits of Chinese satellites in the emergent warfighting domain of space. We need reservists to develop strengths in cybersecurity and fortify our nation's critical infrastructure, which supports our digital economy, and then bring your software and networking capabilities to deter attacks within cyberspace and respond proportionally when those attacks do occur. We need you to work on advancing machine learning, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing in Silicon Valley, and add those capabilities to our information and decision dominance in joint all-domain operations. And we need guardsmen to build strong bonds abroad that connect back home through the state partnership program. In strategic competition, our values and views on democracy and the international order are relatively new. The international order, which has dramatically reduced the causes and conditions for large-scale global conflict, has only existed for 7 decades. Our country's grand experiment with democracy has existed for less than 250 years, far shorter than the long history of China. And we cannot take for granted that democratic governments will survive for another 250 years. Our values guide us and convince me that we are right in our cause in defending our nation and our allies in the Indo-Pacific. I strongly believe that our national security is more than our weapons, ships, and planes. At the center of our mission are the men and women who serve in uniform: soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and guardians, active duty service members, and reservists, patriots who risk their lives to defend our homeland, our allies, and our values. Serving as part of the best fighting force in the world is one of the greatest honors in American life. I've seen the bravery and determination of our armed forces firsthand. I've lived it. And I know we're ready to take on the challenges facing our country in the 21st century, in the Indo-Pacific and around the world, so long as we're guided by our shared values, our love of country, and a forward-looking vision for our national security. Thank you.